an independent country. How'd that happen? I want to talk about how many times we've invaded. All right, please work. Now, so we're going to talk about this era of intervention where the Americans pretty much invade everybody, as well as, which will lead us into America into World War I, which is part and parcel of this idea of America must try and fix the world. And then as a consequence of this expanded government role in World War I, how did they try to control behavior at home in order to ensure victory? This is where it gets dicey. Okay, so this is all essentially what I just said now, at length. During the Progressive Era, 1900 to around 1920, as government expanded its role at home, passing a bunch of laws to regulate the economy, making it safe for labor to organize, eventually giving women the right to vote, banning child labor, inspecting food, controlling railway freights, controlling banking policy, all these things to help the common everyday person. During this time, there was an increasing belief that the American government should also intervene overseas to solve other people's problems, to spread our conception of liberty, to spread democracy, to spread free markets, open capitalist markets. This was the theory that led to American intervention overseas at this time. But the reality was that oftentimes this desire covered up what was really happening, which was the development of the American empire. Let me give you a sense of what I'm talking about. This is the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, Central America. All the dark brown colored countries are highlighted because they have been invaded in this time period, 1900 to early 1920s. You have Venezuela, Panama, Haiti, the DR, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Nicaragua, and the rest of these places, not invaded, but controlled through dollar diplomacy, which I'll talk about in a moment. Even Mexico, with the war with Mexico again. So this is all happening at the same time that the Americans are expanding democracy at home. Where does it start? Teddy Roosevelt. The great Teddy Roosevelt, the first progressive president. This was the guy that took the big, what were they? The big oil companies, steel companies, he brought them to court. And he sued them and he broke them up because big monopolies of corporations are dangerous to the economy. It crushes the little guy. It takes consumers' rights away because one corporation that controls an entire industry is bad. At the same time that he's busting up the big corporations in order to protect the consumer, what is he doing at home, overseas, excuse me? He's pushing a far different agenda. Panama, for instance. Let me just show you this map real quick. Here's Panama down here, and here's the Panama Canal that allows you to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, all right? Panama was once part of the country of Colombia. Roosevelt was developing a huge American Navy, a huge American merchant marine, and American trade overseas was expanding. But in order to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back and forth, he didn't want to go all the way to the bottom of South America. That would take too long. He wanted to cut through the Panama province of Colombia. So Roosevelt asked Colombia if they could buy Panama, dig the canal, and operate it. Colombia wanted more money than Roosevelt was willing to pay. So what did Roosevelt do? He encouraged the Panamanians to declare their independence from Colombia. They did. But by themselves, they wouldn't have been able to survive. So Roosevelt landed the U.S. Army, or Marines, and guaranteed Panamanian independence in 1903. Thereafter, the Panamanian government gave the Americans what they wanted, the right to dig the canal and operate it until it was legally given back about 10, 15 years ago. Does everybody remember Manuel Noriega, the dictator of Panama that was overthrown by President George Bush, the first George Bush? The reason why we went into Panama is because the dictator of Panama had become an enemy of America, and we had to legally give back the Panama Canal to a guy that didn't like us. So we got rid of him and we put somebody there that was more friendly. Now, having intervened in Panama to get what we wanted, Roosevelt decided to make it into a policy. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine from the 1820s argued nobody should interfere. No, Europeans should not interfere in North and Central and South American business. We don't want Europeans in our backyard. That was the Monroe Doctrine. In 1904, Roosevelt added a little corollary or an addition that said, not only do we not want Europeans interfering in American issues, North and South American issues, but the United States of America has the right to go into any country it wants to solve chronic wrongdoing. That's a pretty broad justification to go into any country you want and do whatever you want.
Yet not allowing people to get into your business.
So, with that, the Americans went into the Dominican Republic in 1904 and seized the customs houses because the Americans were not getting payments due to them. U.S. banks then managed Dominican finances to make sure monies were collected and American debts paid on a regular basis. 1906, the Americans invade Cuba again, and they keep troops there until 1909 in order to oversee a disputed election to make sure that an American-friendly government is elected. After Roosevelt leaves and William Howard Taft comes to office, at home he's doing a lot of important stuff, breaking up the big corporate monopolies, helping the little guy. Overseas, he invaded Nicaragua in 1909 to protect a government that was friendly to the Americans and their business interests, but the Nicaraguan people were not crazy about. After, Taft did not invade as much, but he funded American-friendly governments in Honduras, the DR, and Nicaragua, making sure that customs were collected, debts to the American government were paid off, and if U.S. companies wanted to establish businesses in these countries, the government would give that land to those American businesses. Woodrow Wilson, who was the most progressive president we had, this guy did a lot for labor, against child labor, regulating food and drug manufacturing. At the same time that he was making life easier for common people in America, overseas, he invaded everybody. Haiti, he invaded in 1915 because the Haitian government refused to allow the Americans control over their banking industry. And we kept the troops in Haiti until 1934. The DR, we helped establish a military government in 1916. The United States controlled customs collections and stayed in the DR until 1924. But the real kicker was Mexico. Mexico was a mess. Now, we had crossed paths with Mexico in the past. In the Mexican War of 1846 and 48, and just bear with me, I'm going to go back to show you a map. This is Mexico in 1914. It stops right here. This is the border with the U.S., the Rio Grande. This is Baja. All this, however, and even Texas, used to be part of Mexico. And we took that all away in the Mexican War of 1846-48. And they were California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado. All that used to be Mexico. And we took it all. So they were a little pissed off. Now, Mexico was having a variety of internal problems. In 1911, Francisco Madero overthrew the dictator, Porfirio Diaz. 2 years later, Victoriano Huerta, with American support, assassinates Madero, and a civil war breaks out in Mexico. Woodrow Wilson, sends in troops to bring some order to Mexico and to keep in power an American-friendly government of Huerta. Huerta, leaves the presidency in 1914, but the Civil War continues. In 1916, a Mexican freedom fighter, Pancho Villa, invades America. A Mexican freedom fighter invaded America. He invades New Mexico and kills 17 Americans. Wilson then orders the invasion of northern Mexico, but he never captures Pancho Villa. So this guy, Woodrow Wilson, who historically tried to bring a better economy at home and during World War I tried to bring a just peace after World War I, in terms of our backyard, Latin America, he was no better than anyone else. So let's talk about World War I. Has anybody in here taken any modern world history class in this or any other college or high school? So World War I is not familiar to you. A little bit. All right. So let me give you the broad strokes. In June of 1914, World War I breaks out. It starts in Europe. It starts off with a relatively insignificant happening. The Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, his name was Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serbian-trained assassin. The name you don't need, you can just Google it. Now, since Serbia and Austria were mortal enemies, Austria wanted revenge on Serbia for training and funding this assassination. But Europe wasn't just Austria versus Serbia. Everybody had friends. And so, let me just show you a map real quick. Here's Austria-Hungary. The assassination took place in Sarajevo. The assassin was trained by Serbia. The Austrians wanted to destroy Serbia because they had a whole bunch of problems with them. But in order to destroy Serbia, Austria wanted the support of their ally, Germany. Because the Austrians knew if they hit Serbia, Serbia's ally is going to jump in. And Serbia's ally is Russia. Right? Now, it gets complicated because the Germans have to support Austria. It's the only friend they got left in Europe. And the Russians are not just allied with Serbia. The Russians are also allied with France, who hates the Germans. The Russians are also allied with the British, but hate the Germans. So, when Austria and Serbia go to war, and the Germans say, yeah, we'll help you, they knew they were going to cause World War I. Because the moment these two started fighting, and this country got involved, this country was going to ask for help over here and over here. And so Germany would now have fighting on both sides. And the Germans had a plan. The moment war is going to start, and they're going to fight on both sides, they're going to take out the stronger one first, and then turn around and hit the bigger one. So the moment these two started having a scrap, everybody got brought in. This is what's known as the alliance system, was triggered. The Central Powers of Germany, Austria, and Turkey were eventually at war with the allies of Britain, France, Russia, Japan, and eventually America, because all these allies were coming in to help their friends. Now, the war started in 1914, and the Americans stayed out of it. 1914, 15, 16, 17, it was a bloody stalemate. And by bloody stalemate, I mean, this is what the war looked like. It wasn't a war of movement. It was a war where technology made the defense stronger. So soldiers were trained to attack, but the defense, especially with the machine gun, and they're wearing these masks because they invented poison gas at the time, the defense was so strong that you had this awful situation where soldiers are trained to attack, but the defense would just destroy them. They would mow them down like blades of grass. And so soldiers, to protect themselves, would dig trenches. And so now you have these trenches that stretch across hundreds of miles because every time you attack, you get repulsed and you get stuck. And these big holes here are the holes left over after an artillery shell explodes multiple times, and then it rains in them. One of the worst things that ever happened, these guys are ordered to attack. And if they're not mowed down by machine gun fire or by artillery fire, oftentimes they either get stuck in barbed wire, where they get picked off by rifles, or they fall into these pits and they sink because their legs get stuck in the mud, and they sink into quicksand and they drown. So World War I was a bit of a mess. Now, how did we get into it? Well, at first, we remained neutral. But we had mixed sentiments. On the one side, there was a lot of sympathy with Britain, because America had British roots: English language, Protestant religion, the governmental system of checks and balances. But there was also a lot of Americans who had no interest in being in the war, because while some Americans were very pro-British, other Americans, like the Irish Americans, they were anti-British because Britain still ruled over a part of Ireland back in Europe. Then there was a lot of German Americans that had no interest in fighting against their mother country. Plus, there was a lot of Socialist Party, feminist movement. They were against the war. So America remained neutral because the country was divided. But we got sucked in nonetheless. Why? In 1915, a British cruise liner was torpedoed by German submarines. It sank, and on that boat that was suspected of having war material, something like 115 Americans died. The American government protested and said this was a neutral ship. It wasn't a warship. It should be off limits. The Germans were petrified that the Americans were going to come into the war and they couldn't handle another enemy, so they suspended submarine warfare. But by 1917, the Germans are desperate. They look like they're going to lose this war, and they got to do something. So they decide they're going to restart submarine warfare, sink everything that's sailing to Europe in order to weaken their enemies. And if the Americans come in the war, well, maybe Germany would have won the war by that point. This turned out to be a really, really bad decision. The other reason why the Americans eventually got stuck and dragged into the war is because not only were the Germans now sinking American shipping, like merchant marine shipping, they were sinking American sailors and American products destined for Europe. They were killing American sailors. The Germans reached out to Mexico and said, if you declare war on the United States and we win this war, Germany and Mexico, we will give you back everything the Americans took from you. California, Texas, etc. Well, this message was leaked to the press. The Americans found out about it. The American press, the American people went ballistic. So between the sinking of American shipping and sailors and the collusion with Mexico, the Americans demanded war. And in April of 1917, the U.S. declares war on Germany. Then things get a little complicated, and this is where Woodrow Wilson comes in. In 1917, after the Americans declared war, Russia had a revolution. The monarchy was kicked out, and Russia became a communist nation, as it was up until about 15, 20 years ago. One of the first things the new communist government, led by Vladimir Lenin, did when he takes over Russia is he pulls Russia out of the war. He says, this war is being waged by wealthy people and the poor people are doing the fighting and dying. I'm calling an end to it. He literally called an end to the war. He just told the soldiers, turn around and come home. Just stop fighting. He didn't even negotiate for peace. He just said, come on home. The Germans chased after them. Eventually a peace treaty was signed. But the other thing that Lenin did in order to show how immoral World War I was he published all the secret treaties negotiated between the various countries that said if we win, we'll take this territory, that territory. And he essentially embarrassed the world and said, you say you're fighting for democracy. You're not. You're fighting for a land exchange. So now Woodrow Wilson comes in, and he's already declared war on Germany, and he's got to bring his people into the war. But Woodrow Wilson has got this moral attitude of superiority. He's not going to fight a war for land. He's going to fight a just war with a just peace. Is this going to be a worthwhile war? And so this led to his release of what's known as the 14 points. His policy of what we should do once we win this war. And the 14 points are a pretty broad statement of things like, most of it is good. All nations should have the right of self-determination. What does that mean? It means, let me again bring you back to the map. In this Austro-Hungarian Empire, there are Austrians, there are Hungarians, but there's also Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Romanians, Serbians, Croatians, Bosnians, Slovenians, Italians, and Ruthenians. I think I got all of them. Oh, and those are all the Christians. And there was a Muslim population as well. According to Woodrow Wilson, these huge empires, and the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, should all be broken up, and all the peoples living in those empires should have their own country. The people should have their own countries, their own government. That is the purpose of this war. Freedom of the seas. Everybody should trade freely everywhere. There shouldn't be any restriction. Open diplomacy. No more secret plans that get people into wars.
That's why cats is king for kings and...
Keep going? You done?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I thought you were
That
building up to something. All right.
Because I was reading it, it just clicked to me that as Kat explains it now, like, you know, that her was king for kings and poor, like, you know, like the poor.
Yes.
Poor.
Yes. Yes.
Kind of clicked to me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, the Germans were betting the Americans, even though they declared war, they couldn't get troops to the European theater fast enough. They were wrong. The Americans landed hundreds of thousands of troops very quickly. They went on the offensive against the Germans in 1918, pushed them back, and by November of 1918, Germany was defeated. America stood triumphant. And because they got into the war late, they could pretty much call the shots at the peace table. And Wilson tried to impose these 14 points. So the point of this digression into World War I is to show that the American progressive instinct to fix problems at home also drove them to get involved overseas to end this war against the Germans and their ruthless attack on France and Britain and Russia. And it was a war of democracy and democratic nations against absolute governments. But what did this mean at home? The expanded government role during World War I is problematic because it gave people the belief that now that the government has drastically expanded its power, now we can impose all those reforms we were dreaming of, but the government never really had the authority to do so. But in wartime, Americans have traditionally allowed their governments to do whatever the hell they want in the interest of preserving the war effort, right? So what happened? During World War I, the government drastically expanded its powers. For instance, conscription. 24 million people registered for the draft, and they were called up for service. This is a drastic expansion of the government's role in your day-to-day life. The government interfered in the economy. Raw materials were regulated. How much coal was being used for the war, determined by the government, or steel, cotton. This was all regulated by the government. Manufacturing prices. This was no longer a free market economy. The government said what you can and cannot charge for something. Everything has to be for the war effort. Railroads. The government finally does what the populists have been asking for, what the progressives have been asking for. In World War I, the government took over the railroads to regulate transportation and prices. Labor. The National War Labor Board brought together government, business, and labor, and essentially the government said, labor needs to be recognized, treated equally, wages have to be improved because we are at war now. We cannot afford workers to go on strike. So pay them whatever they want, give them whatever reforms they want. We need them to work because we need the bullets, the guns, the tanks, whatever. We can't have a strike. But business also benefited. Business was told, if you play ball and you give labor what they want, you will have guaranteed government orders for your company. Whatever money you lose by paying workers more, you will have guaranteed government orders. You'll make more money than you've ever seen in your entire life. And the government also started raising taxes to pay for the war. This was a drastic increase in the role and power of government. But how do you make sure that people support you? Because like I said, not everybody was against the Germans, and not everybody wanted the war effort. And even after Americans were sunk in 1915 and 1917 on the high seas, this was a huge expansion of government interference in people's lives and their economy. How do you convince them that this is okay? Propaganda. There was a big group of people that came out publicly, vocally against the war. The Socialist Party, led by Eugene Debs, came out very early and said, this is a war of rich people, and the only people doing the dying are the poor and the workers. The poor and the working class do not benefit from this war. So don't show up for the draft. Don't support the war effort. The industrial workers of the world, those labor unions that would go on strike, militant strikes, demand better wages, they came out against the war for the same reason. This is a rich people's war, but the poor are doing the fighting and the dying. This is problematic. If you have these big groups that are coming out against the war, it's going to interfere with the draft. It's going to interfere with the raising of money to pay for the war. So how did the government respond? Wilson created something called the Committee on Public Information to coordinate all war propaganda. What does that mean? The country was blanketed with pamphlets, posters, movies justifying the war effort. Government representatives would go to towns and cities all over the country and give 4-minute speeches saying, this is why you should support the war. The government just flooded the country with propaganda. And what did the propaganda say? You've got to support the war because we are fighting for democracy overseas just like we're fighting for democracy at home. The argument was, this government supports labor. We want to give the workers economic freedom at home. But part and parcel of this fight to preserve democracy and freedom and equality at home is we got to do it for people overseas. And those nasty Germans invaded innocent countries and are taking away their lives, their freedoms, their land. And we got to stand up for the weak overseas. And in order to convince Americans that it was okay to kill Germans, you had to demonize them. make them subhuman. Remember I said when America dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, in order to do that, you had to dehumanize the Japanese? Remember I said that? This is how the Germans were depicted in posters in order to dehumanize them, to make them monsters. Did I show you that? No, I did not. Yes, I did. Remember that poster of the Spanish-American War? The Spanish as the gorilla? All of a sudden he comes back. There's always a helpless woman that's being victimized. There's always a couple of breasts showing. Right? Remember that poster I showed you? The naked woman being searched by the Spanish? That is the customary German helmet with a pointed top. And destroy this mad brute, the Germans, as a rabid dog. Right? Enlist in the U.S. Army. Beat back the Hun, the monstrous Hun. Pointy helmet, blood-stained bayonet. How do you beat back the Hun? Dark coloring. Looks like a monster. How do you beat him back? Not enlist, buy Liberty bonds. Essentially supporting the war effort by buying bonds to give government the money to fight this war. With the sinking of the Lusitania, in order to convince the Irish to support the war on the side of the British against the Germans, Irishmen avenged the Lusitania, joined an Irish regiment because many ethnic groups could fight together. And this is the Kaiser, the King of Germany. Defeat the Kaiser and his U-boats, the submarines that are sinking American shipping. Victory depends on which fails first, food or frightfulness. Eat less wheat, because wheat is being sent overseas to the troops. Eat less here. The country was blanketed by this stuff. So during this time that the American government drastically expands its role into people's day-to-day lives, they don't stop with propaganda to demonize Germans and to raise money for the war. Like I said, this expanded role of the government in your day-to-day life, it revitalized a lot of progressive issues which kind of took a stop when the war started because the attention was distracted. For instance, women's suffrage. Carrie Chapman Catt exists because of the war. In 1917, she gives this speech to Congress just after the Americans declared war on Germany, and she basically says to these men, how could you possibly go to war against Germany to defend democracy overseas, but half of Americans, the women, don't have the vote? How can you fight for democracy overseas, but keep half of Americans without the vote here? Stop being a hypocrite. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed giving women the right to vote. The other major cause of the progressive reformers that came to pass at this time was prohibition. Does anybody know what prohibition is? It's a great word. Ban the manufacturing and distribution of alcohol. Right? Imagine that. Imagine banning alcohol today. What generally happens in this country when you make something illegal that people generally take for granted that they should have access to? What's that? Black market. What happens when you raise the price of cigarettes in order to curb smoking? People buy more illegal cigarettes. This, in some cases, might be an argument for legalizing certain drugs, since people are buying and using them anyway.
Professor,
yes.
Wasn't that how the Kennedys became rich?
Who?
The Kennedys?
Not just them. Many people. got rich during the Prohibition era through bootlegging. But also the mob in Chicago, Al Capone, etc. These guys made their money by bringing alcohol to people that were going to pay for it, whoever brought it to them. Yeah.
There's a movie about that. I don't remember.
There's many movies about that.
But I know there's one that they show us in high school that they used to be making the alcohol like in those the moonshine.
Yeah.
I think that's.
Well, let me recommend you a movie that you might all might like. It's called The Untouchables, with Kevin Costner, Robert De Niro,
Yes.
Sean Connery. I think it's free on Netflix if you have an account. It's fun. It gives you a sense of the unbelievable violence that the prohibition of alcohol had led to when the mob pretty much took over illegal distribution of alcohol. So how did this country that loves to drink manage to abolish alcohol? Well, it's because everybody was into it. Like who? Employers wanted to eliminate alcohol because they were afraid of their workforce going out drinking after work and then showing up hungover or not at all at work. Women were for it because they didn't want their husbands going and wasting all their money at bars, coming home and beating them. Then there was anti-immigration people who felt many of the poor working class Italians and Russians were just drinking themselves silly, and that was a problem. Led to sin. Also, during the war, when there was a rise in anti-German sentiment, it was easy to ban alcohol because many Germans brewed beer. It's part of the national culture. Anybody ever heard of Oktoberfest? Yeah. That's the German culture. They drink a lot of beer in Germany, and in Ireland, for that matter. So, in 1917, Congress passes the 18th Amendment banning alcohol. Now, the other major consequence of this expansion of government's role is the destruction of all dissent. During World War I, there was a hyper-patriotism that essentially said, if you don't support the war, you are un-American, and you will be targeted. And the federal government made it a law. In 1917, the Espionage Act said spying is illegal, but also it said if you interfere with the draft, that is a criminal act. You do not have the freedom to interfere with the draft. If you do, we're arresting you. The Sedition Act of 1918 was even better. The Sedition Act of 1918 said if you make any statements which will cast contempt, scorn, or disrepute on the American system of government or its economic system, they'll throw you in jail.
But wasn't that violating the First
Oh God, yes. But we violate the First Amendment all the time during war, and then later on we forget that law, which was passed in the heat of paranoia. Now, this was at the federal government. And remember the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, that demanded their freedom of expression to say we have the right to unionize and we have the right to protest the draft? Well, they were destroyed under this act. Leaders arrested, offices destroyed, completely broken up. But this was at the federal level. Even the state governments got involved. Teachers were told by state governments you had to swear a loyalty oath if you wanted to keep teaching. Curriculum, your syllabus, that was regulated by the state to make sure it was appropriately patriotic.
Sounds like communism.
Well, it's all about expanded government roles, which can be anything. Communism, fascism, could be anything. Vigilantes marched through the streets looking for signs of quote-unquote disloyalty. And if workers were on strike, they would be deemed unpatriotic and beaten up. At this time, patriotism was defined as support the government, support the war, support capitalism. Anything less, and you are un-American, unpatriotic. Well, what about the progressives? These people that were fighting for democracy and all those rights of the common everyday people, did they speak up? No. They had worked so hard to expand the role of government that they were completely unprepared for the blowback of the exploitation of this expanded role. But also they were also cowed and made fearful of speaking up because of the hyper-patriotic attitude of World War I. And with that, I come to an end. Any questions? We'll finish off chapter 19 next class. Audio. Not today. The beginning of next class.